Hi guys, this is the first of two videos for aggregate demand, so I'll split it up just because there's a bit going on. What you need to know here is obviously what aggregate demand is, and then you've got to look at all the factors that impact it. So we're now dealing with the macro economy, and I'm just going to skip ahead to the graph. So this is the graph that we're using, okay? Aggregate supply is curved. I've spoken about that in class. And then you've got a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So we're going to come in and understand what that thing is and then all the reasons why it can either shift to the left or the right. Notice that when it shifts, like if you imagine the aggregate demand curve shifting to the right, you're going to have a new equilibrium point. And with that equilibrium point, you're going to be able to make conclusions about what happens on the y-axis. So in this case, what happens to inflation, and then also what happens on the x-axis. So in this case, what happens to real GDP. And then as an extension of that, you can then make meaning around what's going to happen to unemployment. So no matter what happens in terms of the curve shifting left or right, you're always in a position to comment on inflation, unemployment, and economic growth, okay? We're going to build those into our goals in the back end of this unit. So I always want you to constantly be thinking how aggregate demand is changing and the impact that change has on our macro economy. Okay, so you've got 6 factors that you need to learn, and I'll go through them one by one. Hopefully, the first few are nice and simple. So the first one is disposable income. This refers to the total amount of money available to an individual or household for spending or and saving after taxes have been deducted. So basically, if you've got more money to spend, it's highly likely that you will spend a segment of it, maybe not all of it, you might save some of it, but the idea is if you've got more money to spend, you're probably going to get out there and spend it. So we should start to see increases in consumption spending. So remembering that the aggregate demand equation is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, you're looking to link how the change in the factor impacts the equation, and then based on the change in the equation, what the impact is to aggregate demand. And then like I said before, depending on that change in aggregate demand, how is that going to impact inflation, unemployment, and economic growth? So that one's nice and simple. It's linked to consumption spending, and then obviously if it's increasing, then aggregate demand is going to go up. And this is what it would look like, okay? So the next factor, I'm going to skip this one. The next factor is consumer confidence, and the third factor is business confidence. So they're kind of similar in a way. Consumer confidence obviously relates to consumers, so we're dealing with C in our equation, and business confidence relates to I, investment spending, so we're dealing with I in our equation. So consumer confidence is simply the degree of optimism that consumers feel about the overall state of the economy. If you're feeling really confident, you're feeling really good about your economic future, well, you're probably going to get out there and spend more money. So an increase in consumer confidence, greater optimism for your economic future, increased consumption spending, that's going to increase aggregate demand, okay? So it's going to shift that demand curve to the right, and then obviously it's going to lead to a whole variety of impacts. So if we were to assume aggregate demand shifting to the right, think about what's happening on the y-axis, what's happening to inflation, and what's happening on the x-axis, what's happening to output, and then by consequence, what's happening to unemployment. This is consumer sentiment. So over the past few years, it's been hovering around 80. So it hasn't really gone up or down in the last couple of years. You can see it had a massive downward trend following the COVID years, and that's probably because the government pulled their support in terms of financial aid that they provided businesses and consumers. So generally, some consumers were feeling pretty nervous about the state of their employment situation, but we're seeing it hover around 80 over the past 2 years. Because that number is less than 100, it suggests pessimism. So we're going to see consumption spending continue to decline in that environment. And then business confidence, which I kind of spoke to before. So this deals with investment spending. So if businesses aren't feeling confident about their economic futures, they're not going to spend their money, they're going to save it. In this case, I've said an increase in business confidence leads to greater optimism about producers, about the future economic conditions. So we see an increase in investment spending, which increases aggregate demand. Okay, so consumer and business confidence are very similar. Consumer deals with C, business deals with I. Just keep that in mind. And then last 2 years, you can see business confidence very similar to consumer confidence has also taken a bit of a nosedive. So we're below 100, which means we're generally pessimistic. Businesses are generally pessimistic. They're probably not going to be spending their money. So a decrease in I, decreasing aggregate demand. Let's have a quick look at this one. Explain how one aggregate demand factor and one aggregate supply factor have caused changes in the business cycle. So this is a 2 by 2, 2 marks for the AD factor, 2 marks for the AS factor. We're not in a position to deal with AS just yet, so we would assume AD for 2 marks. You might come in and say, okay, well, over the past 2 years, business confidence has tended to decrease. It's definitely lower than 100 index points, which means that it's generally pessimistic, which means businesses are less likely to be spending their money. So we should see a decrease in I, which decreases aggregate demand. Okay, that's what this question is fishing for. We then need to link it to the business cycle. So if we've got a decrease in aggregate demand, just think, what phase of my business cycle might I be in? And that's going to fit really nicely with a contraction. So during a contraction, we see aggregate demand falling. So there must be a link between those two. Okay, my fourth factor is interest rates. So interest rates refers to the cost of borrowing. This one's interesting too. It also impacts consumers and businesses. So basically anyone with debt is going to feel the pinch. And anyone that is thinking of taking on debt is also going to feel the pinch. So let's take it from the perspective of a decrease in interest rates. So if there's a decrease in the cost of borrowing, it means that individuals, so consumers with debt, now have lower interest repayments. If they have lower interest repayments, it means they have more money to spend on goods and services. So think about yourself for a moment. You're a consumer. Let's assume that you've got some debt. Your interest rates go down. You now have more money to spend on goods and services. So you're probably going to get out there and do a little bit of spending. That's going to increase consumption spending, so increasing C, and that's going to increase aggregate demand. So that's one story that you can tell. The other side of that story is related to businesses. So obviously businesses that have debt, and there's lots of businesses out there that have debt, they now are going to enjoy lower interest repayments, which means that their profits are actually going to increase. So if that's the case, they're also going to have more money to spend. So they're probably going to see an increase in their investment spending. And if that's the case, then that should increase aggregate demand. So the impact to consumers and businesses should be trending in the same direction. If it's a decrease in interest rates, it's an increase in C and I. And if it's an increase in interest rates, it's a decrease in C and I. So get those two stories right. You don't need to combine consumers and investors. I would recommend picking one of them and doing it well. Likewise, you can speak to consumers and businesses that already have debt in the sense that they're going to have higher interest repayments, or you can speak to consumers and businesses that are thinking about taking on debt. So if you're thinking about taking on debt and it's now more expensive to access, then you might be discouraged from doing so, and that's obviously going to impact C and I. You can see here, guys, that the cash rate has exploded over the past few months, if not year and a half or so. So these really low levels are associated with COVID. So obviously during COVID, there was a massive downturn in economic growth. So the Reserve Bank of Australia reduced the cash rate as low as possible. And that was designed to stimulate consumption and investment spending for those reasons we just spoke about. But more recently, we've seen massive issues with inflation being too high. And so the RBA has increased the interest rate, as you can see here, to almost 4.5%. The reason that they've done that is because they are trying to reduce consumption and investment spending, because if they can do that, then they can decrease aggregate demand. Think about it. If you shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, what's going to happen to inflation? Think about the pressure on factors of production and those arguments that we've spoken about in class, okay? So a decrease in aggregate demand will lead to a shift to the left of the aggregate demand curve. This means there's a decrease in output, which means that there's a reduction in the demand for factors of production from producers because they're not going to be producing as much. Which means that those factors of production are going to experience a decrease in their prices. They're going to get cheaper because they're not as in demand as they once were, which means that the cost of production falls. And if that's happening, then often producers will pass those savings on to consumers in the form of lower prices. So overall inflation is going to fall. If that's not sort of making sense to you, rewind the video, go back and have another listen, okay? You need to be able to follow that argument through. So being mindful that when you do make the link of the change in aggregate demand to inflation, economic growth or unemployment, inflation is by far the hardest because there is just so much to say, okay? Economic growth overseas, I'm just whipped through this one nice and quickly. So basically, we're in Australia. If China is booming, they're going to want more of our resources, okay? So China's booming, economic growth's going up over there. They're going to demand more of our exports, which is good for us. So we're going to have a period of an increase in the demand for Australian exports, in particular commodities like iron ore. So we're going to see an increase in exports in our aggregate demand equation, and that's going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand. And so follow that argument through the other way. If China had a recession or an economic downturn, obviously that would decrease the demand for exports, which would lead to a decrease in decrease in exports, which would decrease aggregate demand. So just have both ready to go. And then the last one. So this is the tricky one, right? This is the one that we continue to talk about in class, and it's going to take us a few goes to get, all right? But there's two scenarios happening. So every time exchange rates change, it's going to impact your exports and it's going to impact your imports, and that's all to do with purchasing power. So how has the purchasing power for Australia changed? How has the purchasing power for our overseas trading partners changed? That's what you need to know. So it refers to the value of one currency in terms of another. We're going to assume there's a depreciation of the Aussie dollars, all right? So let's assume there's a depreciation of the Aussie dollar and you're an Australian. It means that your currency is now no longer as valuable against other currencies as it once was. So if you're in Australia and you're using your Australian dollars to buy something from overseas, you can't buy as much as you used to. Your purchasing power has gone down. And so what that does, guys, is it leads to a decrease in the demand for imports, okay? So that's the story in Australia. If you're overseas, however, and the Australian dollar depreciates, that's a really good thing for you. It means that your currency, your local currency, is now worth more. And so if you're in Australia and the dollar has gone down, it basically means that your trading partners, let's take China, for example, they're going to enjoy higher purchasing power. Their dollar goes further. They can now use it to buy more Australian goods and services. So what we see there is an increase in the demand for Australian exports. So when you have a depreciation, it's imports down because our purchasing power has fallen, but it's exports up because the purchasing power for our trading partners has gone up. And so if you plug those two things into the equation, an increase in X plus a decrease in M, overall that's going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand, which is a good thing in terms of shifting the curve to the right and then thinking about all the implications that's going to have on your Y and your X curves, okay? The flip side of that argument is an appreciation of the Aussie dollar. So if you assume that the Aussie dollar has gone up in value, it now means that as an Australian, that's good for us. My dollar goes further overseas. I can now buy more imports because I've got higher purchasing power, okay? However, for our overseas trading partners, it's not so good. So if the Aussie dollar goes up relative to their local currency, it means that their purchasing power has fallen, which means their demand for our exports is going to go down. They can't buy as many as they used to because their value of their currency's gone down. And so we have a decrease in X. So when you have an appreciation of your currency, you're going to see an increase in M plus a decrease in X. And if you pop that through the aggregate demand equation, guys, that is going to lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. That's a lot, okay? Make sure you go back and rewind and listen to that again if you need to, and start to write out those linear arguments so that it makes sense. And if nothing else, just associate a decrease in the value of your currency with an increase in aggregate demand and vice versa. Okay, last little bit, have a look at this question here. A is pretty self-explanatory. You'd use a definition to answer that. But I want to show you this one here, B. It's not often the case that you're pigeonholed very often. So just thinking about which factors you like the most, which ones you find the easiest to speak to, but do be prepared to maybe speak about one or two in particular. You know, exchange rates is hard and we're obviously looking to separate you. So making sure that exchange rates and interest rates are at the top of your list of revision. So you need to explain how one AD factor may cause a business cycle contraction. Be mindful that a contraction is a decrease in aggregate demand. So you want to speak to scenarios that lead to that outcome. So you might speak to a decrease in consumer confidence. You might speak to an increase in interest rates. You might speak to exchange rates. Let me get this right. To get a decrease in aggregate demand, you would need to have an appreciation of the Aussie dollar, because that would lead to an increase in M and a decrease in X. And that's what would decrease aggregate demand. So making sure that those arguments are nice and tidy. Cool. Guys, I hope you find that helpful. Please reach out if you need some help.